If you live in the UK, chances are you know someone who's been the victim of fraud. Roughly 5 to 10% of UK adults experience fraud each year, and the chances of you getting your money back are basically zero. With the issue rising up the political agenda, on Wednesday the government announced their new plan to tackle the UK's so-called fraud epidemic, which basically involves co-opting the big tech companies into doing more about fraud on their platforms. So in this video, we're going to look at the UK's ongoing fraud epidemic, the government's new plan to fix it, and whether it'll actually work. Now, before we start, it's worth pointing out that TLDR got a chance to learn about the government's plan relating to fraud prevention during a recent visit to number 10 Downing Street, where the government unveiled their new strategy to YouTubers and influencers for the first time. We've made sure that our access to this conference hasn't affected the integrity or content of the script, but we still thought it best to be fully transparent. Anyway, back to the video. At first glance, the UK's crime statistics seem pretty rosy. If you're only looking at physical crimes like burglary and assault, then total crime numbers have been falling steadily since 1997 and are now at an all-time low. According to the ONS, there were an estimated 5 million physical crimes committed. In 2021, while that might sound high, it's down 50% compared from 2010 and the lowest figure on record. While this is obviously good news, unfortunately for both ordinary Brits and the UK, the fall in physical crime has been basically offset by a dramatic rise in cybercrime, and especially fraud. In fact, in 2021, the last year for which ONS data is available, there were an estimated 5 million cases of fraud, the vast majority of which are online, and another 2 million cases of computer misuse. 5 million cases of fraud implies that nearly 1 in 10 UK adults were a victim of fraud in 2021, and fraud now accounts for over 40% of all crime. If you include fraud and computer misuse, total crime is at the same level as 2004. While provisional data suggests that there were slightly fewer fraud cases in 2022 than 2021, it's still by far and away the most common crime in the UK, and fraud costs the UK something like £190 billion every year, which is why some commentators have described the UK as experiencing a fraud epidemic. To make matters worse, victims of fraud have little to no recourse. If you're a victim of fraud, you're supposed to report your case to Action Fraud, which was set up in 2009, but there's basically zero chance of anything happening. Less than 1% of the million or so cases reported to Action Fraud each year results in a charge or prosecution. In fact, while the number of fraud cases is rising, the number of fraud-related charges is actually falling, which is why Action Fraud is now disparagingly nicknamed Inaction Fraud. On the rare occasion that a fraudster is caught, the charges are usually pretty minimal. The maximum sentence for fraud is 10 years, but the vast majority of offenders only receive a small fine. Anyway, on Wednesday, the UK announced a new fraud strategy to combat this issue. The plan includes a couple of technical fixes. For example, the government plans to ban so-called SIM farms, which allow criminals to send scam texts to thousands of people at the same time, and cold calls on all financial products, which should make it easier to identify cold calling scams. The government also wants to hire another 400 fraud specialist police officers in order to create a new national fraud squad and replace Action Fraud with a new state-of-the-art reporting centre, which will be up and running in the year. While we don't have any specifics just yet, the government will also be looking into voluntary agreements with banks and big tech companies to get them to provide more support for users against fraud. So that's the government's new plan, but will it work? Well, while it's generally a good thing that the government is paying attention to the issue, these measures alone look insufficient. As we see it, there are basically 3 criticisms to be made here. First, it's just not enough. Even if the government hires another 400 fraud specialists, that will still mean that less than 5% of all police officers are focused on fraud, despite the fact that fraud accounts for over 40% of all crimes and has a conviction rate of less than 1%. Second, one of the main problems with the UK's approach to fraud is that there are too many departments involved, which means that it's everyone's problem but no one's priority or responsibility. According to the ICAEW, there are about 20 bodies, including separate police forces, currently responsible for tackling fraud. While it's good that the government has appointed a specific minister for fraud, which might help centralise the issue in the long term, by creating another bespoke police force and replacing action fraud with yet another reporting centre, the government is only adding to this problem. Third, the government is still relying on voluntary agreements with big tech companies to deal with fraud. Basically, originally, the government wanted to create a new offence, which would require big tech companies like Facebook and Twitter to remove fraudulent content from their platforms or reimburse users who were the victims of fraud. This would be something like the failure to prevent fraud offence proposed by the Public Accounts Committee in their recent report, which came out in March of this year. In the end, however, the government decided that this would be too demanding for tech companies and would ultimately discourage them from operating in the UK. Instead, the government is going to rely on what it describes as voluntary charters with big tech companies and banks, which basically involves asking them politely to do more about fraud. Now, to be fair to the government, these voluntary charters do sometimes work. For example, a voluntary charter with the telecom sector to introduce new anti-scam software led to a 90% reduction in spam texts. Nonetheless, it would be a bit hopeful to rely on the goodwill of big tech companies for an issue of this magnitude. While the new plan isn't perfect, this isn't entirely the government's fault. The internet makes it harder than ever to track down fraudsters and allows criminals to commit fraud from outside the UK. The government estimates that about 70% of fraud cases have an international element, and the UK just doesn't have the resources to track down and extradite these guys. Perhaps instead of trying to catch the perpetrators, the government would be better off focusing on preventing the crime in the first place. Educational campaigns making people aware of fraud and helping them identify scams would be a good start. There are currently at least 13 fraud-related educational campaigns, which is obviously too many. Focusing on more effective education might be better for money than the government's current plans. If you made it this far, you'll definitely enjoy the Modern Conflict series. That's a show made by our friends over at Real Life Law, where they break down recent conflicts from around the world, including the Ethiopian civil war and the war in Ukraine, which we've discussed a bunch before in TLDR's videos, as well as things like the US's invasion of Afghanistan and the Turkey-Greek Cold War. It's an incredible series, and it's only available on our streaming service, Nebula. You'll find a bunch of TLDR stuff on Nebula too. Every weekday we post an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, exclusively on Nebula, giving you bonus discussions and explainers. On Sundays, we release our show This Week in Parliament, which summarises the week's goings-on in Westminster, only on Nebula. Throughout the week, we released videos earlier on Nebula than on YouTube. Every video on Nebula is ad-free, which means that this isn't even here. And most importantly, signing up to Nebula is the best way to support TLDR and all the creators building the platform. It's also super cheap, just a couple of pounds a month. So if you want all of that incredible stuff, then please do sign up using the link in the description.